in those big I find sculpins in those big flat runs. Like when I'm doing cleanups and stuff, I'm going through I'm flipping rock barriers and rock dams and stuff, and sculpins are jetting out, and then they're sitting in that stuff. So like surprisingly, I find a lot of sculpins in um, these like lower flat kind of runs, and so I just started swinging streamers through these flat runs, and occasionally you find trout just holding up and on seams or in like I don't know if there's bigger rocks or structure, but I pick up fish every once in a while on it.
Yeah, because I feel like when I've gone through that run, or I'll skip a lot of water that is like that because I never, it's too shallow to nymph fish.
Yeah.
And I just feel like it's too fast to do a dry dropper. So that makes sense, I guess. Might as well utilize it. And if there's fish sitting in there. And I think reading in this book too, Tom Rosenbauer talks about how sometimes those fish kind of push towards the end of the pools and
Hmm.
kind of hold there, like those tail outs or those flatter sections you would normally kind of float over.
So that run we're talking on the Yakima, on the far right side, like when you're coming into it, there's the right side and the left side. The left side is really shallow, so you can pull your drift boat over and park, and you can wade out like in the fall pretty far out. And so what I'm doing is I'm swinging you can do your trout spay or your single hand. You're swinging these streamers right on the shelf. So there's like the top of the shelf, and then there's the drop off like into this little like it's not a big deep, it's like it would almost be like a ditch in the water, and these fish I'm like swinging right up on that flat part, and so that's like it's just very simple shelf. So like we're standing on the upper part of the shelf, and then it kind of drops down a little bit, and then it drops into that ditch, and I think that just gives them a little deeper water. I don't know if they feel safer there or what, but I always find fish swinging on that.
How deep are you fishing your sculpins?
Um, I mean, I'm doing like it depends on the time of year. I in the fall I've just done like if there's like a fast, intermediate, and then there's a slow, like an intermediate, a fast, and a super fast. I'm going with like the fast, and it's like I think it's like a 6 or 7 second sink rate. So I mean, or it's got to be a little quicker than that. It's between like 4 and 6, so it's getting down pretty quick, but not so fast that I'm like dragging the bottom.
Or so you're going, is that an integrated sink tip line? Or is that a sink tip? Or is that a tip
That's just a sinking tip I add onto my floating line.
and how long is that tip?
Between I want to say it's like 6 foot, 6 and 8 feet, somewhere in there. It's just the Orvis standard. I don't have all these off the top of my head, but and then I'm tying a leader off of that. I'm doing like a 2 foot like leader off of that with like 1x or 0x.
And that
So
is that nylon or is that fluoro?
that's fluoro.
Okay.
So I can sink, so it sinks down, gets down there,
And
and
then
it's a little stronger.
what about your fly? Is that also weighted or is that unweighted?
Um, I get my flies from Eric. They're these like they call them, he calls them like the killer sculpins or something, and they got dumbbell eyes on the front, and then they got zonkers off the back, and then he does all this magical stuff in between, and they just got really nice like motion on them, and fish love them. It's almost like he takes a steelhead pattern, and he shrinks it down and makes it natural colors, and like you swing them by trout, and I mean, everywhere I've gone, I've used them in lakes. I've used them in other rivers. I used them in when I went to Montana. I would hook fish on them on the swing.
Hmm.
It's They're deadly. You gotta get some from Eric. Like if you're looking to swing, ask Eric to make you some.
I think I've got some here. Let me open this box that Eric gave me. That's a gravel right there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
you
what
can
we're
take.
the Eric's tying is a graboid leech, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah. I really, I haven't. I didn't try these at all up here in Alaska this year. I really want to try these graboids for these. I mean, I know these trout are going to eat them. I'm just too scared to honestly to throw them because they're so. I've only got like 2 of them. And then in this last podcast that Keaton was talking about taking photos of their favorite of your flies, like if you don't know what they are, this is a good. I bought this fly from Blackfoot River Outfitters in Missoula. It's got like it's not a heavy fly. It's got like a sculpin helmet, but it's one of those like neutrally buoyant sculpin helmets.
Mhm.
It's articulated. This is my favorite, best producing articulated fly. This one streamer has caught dozens of trout, and I only have one of them, and I'm really scared to throw it because I only have this one and I cannot find it anywhere. I've looked up this pattern and I don't even know what it's called, and I can't find it. So I'm really, really cautious when I use it. But
Wait, I got a question for you. Are you allowed to use articulated flies in Alaska?
yes, but only one hook. At least on the river I'm in.
So you can have like you'd have like the front half would have to be like a shank almost, and then you could have like a trailing hook.
Yep. So like on this one, this is a 2-hook fly that I've just busted the front hook off because I was using it on the Yakima, and the same thing, can only have one hook, and Rocky Ford. But so like when I tie my dollies, I have my trailer hook that I have like some of the zonker material attached to, and then I tie it onto the shank of another hook. I just break that hook off.
But
And I just I buy these cheap hooks from Sportsman's. They're Mustad size 6 nymph sprout 3x H, is that heavy, times 2x long. So I just break the bend off. They're like the perfect length, and they break easy. Like they're easy for me to break in the vise when I'm trying to break that bend out, but they're a solid platform for the front of the dolly. And excuse me, when I'm running these, as much as I like to buy quality parts for my flies, I know that with clients I'm going to lose a lot of them. So a lot of times I just buy bulk packs of whatever because I'm going to lose them.
So I'm gonna change the subject right here. Are you gonna hit your residency up there soon, right?
In April, yeah.
In April. And then
in April or May.
And then are you gonna get like resident hunting and fishing license then?
Yes.
Are you gonna be doing some hunting this year or what?
I'm gonna try. I should be able to though this year. Yes.
Do you have a lot like in the area you're in? Is it pretty like is there only certain areas that's like really grizzly bear country, or is there like grizzlies and like all around you?
So technically, to be technical, any brown bear that has access to a salmon river is called a brown bear.
The brown bear, okay.
Because they have access to that food source of salmon.
Yeah.
Make them a lot bigger. And then any interior brown bear, interior Alaska, or doesn't have access to salmon would be considered a grizzly because they're only eating like ungulates or squirrels or berries, basically. Like they only eat mammals and plants. Whereas a brown bear might eat mammals, and might eat plants, and might eat fish, and they tend to be a little bit bigger, it seems like.
So I always thought this is just me living down in the lower 48 and watching like those like Alaska bush people shows and stuff. I always thought that brown bears were like at a certain degree north. They were like this is like a subspecies of the grizzly that like lived up there. So that's really pretty interesting that it's pretty much if they're eating salmon, they're considered a brown bear. And if they're not, would you consider like grizzlies would be like more mountain, like in the mountains more? That would be considered, is there a certain like, because you said there's a certain food they eat, which makes them a grizzly bear, but they tend not to have a like solid water source?
Well, they can have a water source. They're not necessarily eating salmon, so it might not be an anadromous fish that goes up that water. So I mean,
So their main, pretty much the difference is they're like a brown bear's one of its main food sources is like salmon, and then like a grizzly it's not going to get that as much. It might get a little bit, but it's not going to be as much of a food source for a grizzly bear as a grizzly bear might like be eating like dead moose carcasses or like baby moose or baby deer and stuff like that.
correct. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. That's just that was my Washington knowledge coming out. I didn't know much about it, so that is actually really interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know about it either until I moved up here and talked to people who correct me when I'd say brown bear or use brown bear and grizzly bear interchangeably, and they're very different things. And
So,
depends on
so
their
like the ones that follow the caribou herd up in Alaska, those are grizzlies because there's not really. Or can brown bears? Okay, here's a question: can brown bears like during the fall go feed on? They're out feeding on salmon, but as like a caribou herd or something, they need a different food source. Will they leave that river and go chase something else and then come back? Do you know that?
I do not know that for sure, but I don't think that they would leave the river when there's such a high food source.
But like at one point in the year, there's not going to be that food source, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm saying like in the springtime, do you think they would travel far? Do you think they'll stick near their food source?
I don't know. If you look at places like, let's use Kodiak for example, we have the Kodiak brown bears.
Mm-hmm.
There's fish, like there's anadromous fish are in those rivers, and in a lot of ways, I don't think those bears can get very far away from those rivers, if that makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
or from those water sources. So I think that they will. I mean, they're opportunistic. They're going to eat salmon when they're there, but I think if they dig up squirrels and eat those, if a boar eats another cub, or if there's berries there and there's nothing else, they'll go eat that. They'll go. I think a lot of them too go down in the ocean and they'll eat like whatever washes up on shore, dead carcasses and
Yeah.
fish and crabs or whatever.
I've seen that. I've seen it in like in shows like Alaska Wild shows or stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like they'll catch them on the beach like going. But I feel like the beach stuff is more common practice for black bears because it always seems like they catch black bears on the beaches doing like digging clams or something, cracking something open and eating it because it's there.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I'm not a bear biologist or anything. I'm just like what I'm observed from like hunting shows and stuff. It always seems like when people are doing like black bear hunts in Alaska, they'll like take their rafts or their canoes around and they'll like go around the little islands and then they'll try to find black bears like on the beaches. You ever seen that?
Yeah, that's a common practice in like Southeast Alaska or like wherever you have like access to like a protected cove or like Prince William Sound, like Whittier, Valdez. Like that's a pretty common thing. You go around in your boats and you look for bears on the beach and then hop out and try to shoot them. And then same thing, Southeast Alaska, they do that a lot too.
Yeah. So do you think those bears have a fishy taste to them because they're near? Like, do you think they still get that fit? Because I've heard like if black bears eat salmon, you can almost taste the fishiness in the meat.
Oh yeah.
But do you think like the ones that scavenge on beaches kind of get like a salty taste to them?
Um, I don't know. I've just always heard that bears that eat fish or bears that have access to like fish, brown bears, a lot of people don't eat them or even grizzlies because, like in Alaska, legally, it depends on what area you're in, what time of year, but legally, you'd either have to take the head and the hide, or like the head and the meat, or the hide and the meat. But you don't have to always take the meat because a lot of times when they are eating salmon or a lot of fish or whatever, They are so bad just smelling and tasting that you are not required to take the meat. At that point, it's more of a quote trophy hunt, but it's also conservation hunt too, because you can't have too many bears. But in a lot of instances, you don't actually have to take the meat because they know that they're eating fish and it's just not edible and not worth the effort to take the meat. Now, if you're hunting a bear in the spring when they haven't eaten any salmon for several months, you are required to take the meat because that meat can actually still be good since they've just been in the den, um, hanging out, sleeping. And then if you were to shoot, say, an interior bear, or you shoot a bear that's way high up, on like a mountainside that eats a lot of huckleberries, yeah, I'd eat that bear 100% because they're not gorging on salmon.
Sweet. Yeah. You know, I saw something interesting pop up in this Facebook page, the Washington one, and this guy got, it's like completely snowing in eastern Washington, and the guy got a black bear on his camera, and a lot of people, you know, these people aren't like biologists or anything, but I kind of learned that like black bears will actually come out of their hibernation if there's still like a decent food source for these bears to come out, and they don't hibernate as hard as like grizzlies and brown bears. Did you ever know that?
Yeah, I think they go into what's called a torpor, where
Yeah,
they have
yeah,
like a solid sleep. Like they'll wake up and like go do things and then go back to bed.
yeah. That's crazy to me. I always, because you, like growing up, if you go through just like, if we take away the hunting, right, and you go into like public school, they're like, what do bears do? They hibernate. And then you're like, oh, all bears hibernate. That's so cool. And then in my, you know, little Keaton, 10 years old for the rest of his life, thinks that all bears hibernate. And then a Facebook page tells him something different.
Yep.
So,
Yeah. I was ever tell you about the time Emily and I found the bear dens in Washington?
mm-mm.
It was up where we spent a lot of time backpacking and hunting last year.
Mm-hmm.
And the first time we were ever up there, there was still a lot of snow. So much snow we lost the trail. And I got this kind of weird feeling. And I was like, there's these giant like plugs of bear poop. You know, like the giant piles, like when they first get out of the den, they're big plugs. And I was looking at all these tracks, and then there's like these little snow caves that were like built into the hillside that were like kind of collapsed, but there's like bear poop like in and around these little like snow cave things, and like
Yeah.
you could tell the bears have been in and out, and they were like this whole hillside really steep. What would that have been? Like a north facing hillside on really steep, heavy timber, a lot of snow in like the middle of June, and yeah, they had to have been just places where bears had denned up for the wintertime or slept for a while, and it was really sketchy. Definitely a lot of bear sign in there.
Yeah. So I was hunting is like fall, and we're bow hunting, and we came up on, there's this big canyon where I used to hunt at, and we're on there's a road that goes down one side of it, and then like part of it's private, but on the other side, if you go around and then you can get up and go down the other side, you can drop in on the other's face and down into the canyon. But that day we're just kind of driving around like looking for elk and stuff, and we pull up and we see this big bear, and we watched this bear probably for like an hour and a half. We stood out there with our binoculars, and we actually watched him go. We found where his den was, and he like went into his den, and then he would like lay down, and he'd be in there for like 10 minutes, and then he'd get up, and he would, I don't know what he was doing, but he'd like run out, and then he'd like run down the hillside and like along the hillside, and then he'd like put his nose up and he'd sniff, and he'd look around, and then he'd go back up and go back into the den. And this was in like September, mid-September, but it was like one of the coolest experiences to see, because you got to see like where he was staying at, and then you got to see like where he was going, and he was just wandering around, and it's like, what weird activity, you know. But he never went really that far. Like he had like, it looked like he had a kind of a food source near him, and he would like go up into the bushes, and he was like hanging out there for like 20 minutes, and he like, it looked like he was eating something, and then he'd come back down and go down the hillside, sniff, go back into his den, come out and do it again. It was the weirdest thing ever, but really cool to see.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
They're always moving. That's one thing. Like if you're hunting bears and you're like, oh, I don't know if that's a stump or a bear, and if that stump hasn't moved in like 2 minutes, it's definitely not a bear because bears are constantly moving
Yeah.
unless they're sleeping. But other than that, they're always moving.
But um, are they always near? Like, do they travel far away from their den? Do you know that?
I'm not sure. I'm sure that they will den or they'll stay other places. I'm not sure how if they go back to the den every night or not.
Because I know like some animals, like I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard that black-tailed deer will stay in a 5 mile radius for like their whole life.
Mm.
So I'm wondering if there's like similar activity with other animals, like could or there I don't know a ton about bears. I find them fascinating, but like, do you think bears, they have their den and then they don't go like they only go a certain distance and come back?
I'm not sure because I know that cougars stay in
Yeah.
dens, and I know there's a place where I know where there's a cougar den that people see it there quite frequently, but it's always in the den. It has a kill nearby, so it'll like bring it back towards its den. But I also know that cougars have a really huge like home range. There's no possible way it can be on one end of its home range and get back to the other end in the same day because it's if I remember right, it's like 70, 80 mile home range for like one cougar, So I don't know
Yeah.
how that would work. They obviously maybe they have multiple homes, maybe or dens, or maybe they just find a place to hang out. I don't know.
How crazy. Animals are animals are amazing things. It's
Yeah.
like the sheep in the canyon. It's crazy to see them on like one side of the road, and they'll be way up on like this. They'll be hanging on to the side of the cliff, walking up it, and then like, and the next day you come out and they're like 5 miles upriver on another cliff, and you're like, man, those things. They look like they're in a spot that they weren't going to get out of for maybe a day or two, and they're already like they're on the ground. They're all the whole herd's like up canyon, and you're like, it's cool to see. It's just amazing stuff.
Yeah. And then you can definitely tell like where their favorite places are, where it's hard to get to. Like there are places there on the Yakima where the sheep are that you'll almost guaranteed to see them there because they like that area. You know,
Yeah,
same
and
thing.
it's steep.
It's steep as hell.
Yeah,
The only way to get there, you can't drop down from the top. The only way to get there is across the river.
yeah.
I've tried to. I've looked at like Onyx and I've looked at it in person. There's no way in hell you're dropping off the top.
No,
Like
well,
you
and
literally would have to
it
get
never
out of this.
it never looks like when you're across the river. I think I know some spots that you're talking about,
Mhm.
and when you look at them, you're like, oh, that doesn't look like too bad. But if you look at the sheep in the binoculars, they're literally like walking on like a 2 inch like ledge, like climbing up. That's the craziest thing about those sheep is they can pretty much walk on pebbles around cliffs, and they're just hopping and running around. It's amazing.
Yeah, they're crazy.
Yeah. How about have you done much of the lower Yakima bass fishing?
I have not. I've really wanted to. Um, the only time I've ever done it is one time Jesse and I and a friend went down catfishing one night in the lower Yakima, and we stayed up all night and caught a bunch of like bullhead cats and like squawfish.
Yeah.
And we slept in the car, and I woke up at like 5 in the morning, and there's those two guys are still sleeping, and I walked down, and that morning there was like it was like a hatch, and the water was boiling like trout, but they were all really small bass. So all I had was a spinning rod, so I got a little casting bubble and some random small black fly I had in my box, and I cast it out there, and I caught a couple bass doing that, but it was literally just like 5 to 8 inch long smallmouth hitting the surface, eating whatever was hatching. And
Yeah.
I was probably like a sophomore in high school. I didn't know what was going on. I mean, I was
Yeah.
fly fishing there, but I didn't bring a fly rod.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I've heard good things about it. I've just never done it. I should do it. And then I've heard about like there's just a lot of good bass fishing over there too. And I think that's like I think that's starting to become a more popular sport for fly fishing and the carp on the fly over there, which is a growing sport.
Carp are really fun. I wish I had put more effort towards catching carp when I was in Washington. I've caught probably got a couple on the fly rod. They're really fun. They're hard to fish for, but man, it's rewarding when you do catch one. It's really fun to trick them. It's a really good practice. Your accuracy, your presentation, looking for fish, seeing fish underwater, not spooking them, understanding fish behavior and what they eat. Carp are really good, especially for sight fishing. That's one reason I think Rocky Ford is really hard place to fish, but really good for you because it's so hard and challenging that it makes you learn how to fish better when you're, say, on like the Yakima or some high gradient Freestone River where it might not be easy there, but
Yeah,
learn a lot of how fish act underwater. And you can trick them in a slow moving spring creek, highly pressured like Rocky Ford. You could probably do it in a high gradient stream.
and you caught a carp in the Ford, didn't you?
I
By
did
accident.
on accident. I snagged him. I thought he was a I thought he was a trout, or I maybe I thought he was. I can't remember. I think I thought he was a. I knew he was a carp, and I was
Yeah,
sleeping next to him, and I thought I saw him turn his head because a lot of times when you're fishing for carp, you're looking for them to turn their head to the side and set the hook. And so I set it because I thought he turned his head to the side, and maybe he did eat it. I don't know, but I ended up snagging him on the back of his dorsal fin or something. And I just, luckily, I had my dad there. I had my 10 foot four weight, and I didn't fight him very long. My dad ran way downstream, and I just side pressured that fish into the bank. He had to be like 60, 70 yards away from me, but my dad went down and netted it. So I wasn't like, it's not like I was reeling that fish in backwards for 20 minutes. I had that fish on for maybe 2 minutes and got him in. But yeah,
yeah.
there are definitely carp in there. The
Are they
only
fast? Was it did it take off on you at all, or?
That one I don't think really did because he was so big and using that really fast section of Rocky Ford, so he didn't have a lot of room to move. So
Yeah.
that one didn't fight very hard. The first one I ever caught was in Banks Lake. I seen some and I cast out. I had like a 6 weight with a sink tip, and I had this like articulated damselfly nymph that I cast out. And I watched it sink, 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 sink. And this carp was feeding. I think he was in like the mid column or just a few feet off the bottom. And I didn't feel anything, but I saw his head like I all of a sudden like saw him like you can tell when a fish sees your fly, like he just reacts to it. And so I saw him like acknowledge the fly and then like swim over and like turn his head. I didn't see my fly, but I knew my fly was in that zone. Saw him acknowledge the fly, like turned his head, eat it, and then turn back. And that's when I set the hook, and that's when he was on. Uh,
Yeah.
the other carp that I caught, I was in a pond there in Ellensburg, and it was a school of like 3 or 4 pound carp swimming by. And I had tried to intercept them with a cast, and I had snagged on like a lily pad or something, and it spooked them. So they like swam around this cove right under my feet. And so I had a jig head pheasant tail. And as those carp came under my feet, I literally just dropped it off the tip of my rod and like jigged it up and down as they went through the school. And all of these carp in the school swam past it, except the last one. I just watched this carp just suck my fly up right in front of me. It was like a 3 pound carp. It was really fun though.
Yeah, that's cool.
The one in Banks was like probably 10 pounds, and the one that I caught out of Rocky Ford is like 15 pounds. It was a big carp.
I've been over in the like potholes area. I was
Mhm.
fishing trout, and it was like my first year, like my second year fly fishing, and
Mhm.
I was stripping in like just little nymphs. I just cast out, and then I'd strip it back, and
Mhm.
then I had these. I never knew they were in this lake, and I had these carp come all the way to the end of my rod, and then like it's like they saw it's like a deer in the headlight, just stop. And
Mhm.
then for the next like 20 minutes, I'd cast out and they would chase it down, but they would never grab it. And then eventually they just like stayed like 20 feet out away from me. And I never like could get into trout or anything because it was like they're just there giving warning signs to the rest of the fish. Like, don't go near this guy. He's gonna hook you. but I've never caught a carp. So on my to-do list.
They're fun, man. They're a hard fighting fish. They're if you can get them in, if you can handle their first initial run, you're gonna get them in because that initial run is the hardest part of the fight on a carp.
Yeah. And is it long? Is it like a long run or is it like
Long and fast, like it's like they'll take you for a long, fast run.
like are we talking like faster than like a salmon? Like they'll pull you really quick, or like about the same?
They're compared to a bonefish, really.
Yeah.
So I
How
mean,
fun.
they're pretty fast. I don't know if I ever had one take me to my backing because the only one, like the one I caught in Banks, I was in a boat, so I was able to kind of follow it. But
Yeah.
um,
That's cool though.
yeah, they're fun. They are definitely a really fun fish. We don't really have any of that here in Alaska. The closest, I mean,
You do
we guess,
pike.
yeah, there are some pike. I found a little pike pond this year, and I caught a pike. I sight fished a pike out of there. It was like maybe as big as like my water bottle here, like I don't know, like 8-10 inches long.
Hmm.
But that was fun. But there's a lot of sight fishing up here because the river that I guide on is so clear. I watch trout eat flies all day. I'd say easily 40% of the trout we catch, I watch them eat the fly. Because a lot of
That's
times I
cool.
have clients like lift their flies up out of a log jam so they don't get stuck. And I wait to the last second so they lift their flies out as it's like brushing the log. And a lot of times that's when those trout come up and smack that fly because they see that Dalai Lama raising up through the column and it looks like a leech or a lamprey or a bait fish swimming up out of the logs, and those trout go and eat it. So a lot of times I'm like, all right, lift your flies up, but be ready. People are literally lifting their flies out from getting snagged on the bottom, and boom, you'll watch that trout come up and eat it as they're pulling it back towards the surface.
That's rad.
Yeah. Or there are times that like when the pinks and the silvers are in, I mean, that's all sight fishing. You can cast it into a school of pinks and strip it back in, and 5 of them will peel off. Same thing with silvers. You'll watch those silvers and pinks eating or chums inhale your fly. It's all, yeah, that's what gets it done for me, man, is when you can watch a big anadromous fish chase your fly. Like an 8-inch, like when I throw my watermelon Sally and I throw it out there into a school and I watch a 10-pound silver chase down watermelon Sally and eat it. Nothing like that.
Yeah. Do you guys this might be like kind of a dumb question, but do you guys get like cutthroat up there? Like do you get like, because I know they have like in the sea runs, I don't know how far the sea runs go up, but do you ever like, you heard of anyone catching like cutthroat up there or anything, or
Well,
is it just mostly a rainbow game?
mainly rainbow. There's no cutthroat to my knowledge. Um, where I am north. But
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast today on Alaska, and they were talking to a guy in Juneau, and he was talking that they have cutthroat in some of those streams in southeast, like this south part of um, Alaska,
Hmm.
that are like freshwater. So I'd have to do more research, talk to some people in the southeast Alaska, and see if that's true. But I do think we have some sea run cuts in Prince William Sound. I think that would be the northernmost that we would have sea run cuts.
Yeah.
Otherwise, nothing in the interior.
Yeah, that'd be pretty cool to do up there. Or I would just wonder like, I wonder what the growth rate, because I know that like here we have our sea runs, they'll go up, they have to go spawn, so they'll go up into, some rivers and tributaries and stuff. And
Mhm.
then sometimes they'll stay in there, but you can catch some pretty big sea runs. And sometimes I went to the fly fishing, what was that, like in Kirkland, they had like a fly fishing festival up there, and you could go and sit through and listen to people talk. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was talking about sometimes the sea runs, and like it's either the North Sound or South Sound, one of them will stay in the rivers and they'll feed after they're done spawning for a while, because there's not a like there's a really good food source inside that area. And so I was wondering like, could you imagine cutthroat feeding on the same thing as those Alaskan rainbows up there, and how big some of those sea run cutthroats could get if they do it right? Because I mean, you've shown me pictures of the rainbows. I mean, fuck, even the graylings that you show me are massive. So it just makes me wonder, like, what could that do to other species of fish?
Yeah, I don't I don't know. I don't know. I think that the rainbows here are highly migratory because they can't stay in these little creeks and stuff. The same thing, I mean, the grayling have to do the same. They can't stay in these little creeks because they freeze in the wintertime.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I think cutthroat would have a hard time going down into some of these bigger rivers like the Susitna and sitting in
Yeah.
these bigger holes with all these rainbows and stuff with
Yeah.
5 feet of ice, or more.
Yeah. Because this All About Trout book I'm reading, like rainbows, which I thought was pretty crazy, is the guy said that rainbows are actually more aggressive than brown trout, like
Mhm.
in their feeding habits and stuff. And I was like, that's really, because like browns, they'll feed at night, they'll eat big, but then you tell me about like the mouse pattern stuff that's going on up in Alaska. You
Mhm.
can do that on some browns too. So he said the guy was talking and he's like, they're not much different, but if you were to put one like more aggressive than the other, rainbow's feeding patterns are more aggressive than brown trout. And I was just really like kind of amazed by that. Because I always thought like, oh, browns, like they're big, they're aggressive, they can grow like a pound a year pretty much. They're just mean, gnarly butter sticks. And I was just surprised. Yeah.
I agree. I read it in this prospecting for trout with by Tom Rosenbauer. Said the same thing. Rainbows are more aggressive than browns, and in a way, I think a lot of what we think of are like, oh yeah, big brown trout eating big streamers and big mice aggressively. That
Yeah.
is all they eat. They don't eat. They're not aggressive surface feeders or aggressive nymph eaters
Yeah.
because they're so big they can't eat those little things and and sustain themselves. They have to eat big meals, and a lot of times that's going to be at night when they're at the covered darkness. When I was in Pennsylvania in 2017, I think, um, I was fishing a river that was stocked with rainbows and browns. And I remember on one night we were fishing a caddis hatch, and this hole was probably like 200, 300 yards big. You had like big, heavy water at the top end, and it slowed, and it was really deep, heavy current, not heavy current, but it was just pretty fast water, deep, and then it slowly tailed out, and you had this like foamy tail out. All of the rainbows that I caught that evening were in the head of the pool. And then about 2/3 of the way down where it started to slow down, that's where I caught all the browns. There was like a distinct line from the rainbows taking the top head of the hole, being more aggressive in that heavy water, feeding up there, versus those
Mhm.
brown trout in that slower tail out of that pool, eating stuff out of the foam. So that's how I've seen it change like that.
So do you think it was just the rainbows just were kicking the browns out, or do you think it was like the browns? Because I know like browns really like that slower kind of
Mm-hmm.
pond water. They like the slower moving water. It's just easier. I don't know. Maybe is it easier for them to feed? Do they just like sitting in it better because they don't burn as much energy? So
Probably
I
both. You might get
probably a little bit of both. And if they are like, if rainbows are more aggressive than browns, and they're just kicking them out, because I've been in rivers and I'm like standing on a log jam. Right underneath the log jam you can see like 17, 18, 19-inch rainbows, and then there's a like line right behind them where it's like your 14, 13, 12, 11-inch rainbows, and then there's a line behind them and it's all your like 9, 8, 7, 6-inch rainbows. And it's really cool to see these like 14-inch rainbows shoot up and to these big, towards the bigger rainbows. And there's not as many big rainbows, there's like 5 or 6 of them. And then the middle ones, there's like 10 of them, and then the back ones there was like 30 of them, of these little fish. But these these like 14-inch rainbows would jet up to these like 4 or 5 big fish, and the big fish, one would be feeding, and then the other one would go and chase the 14-incher back down into his spot and turn around and then get back into his feeding pattern, or her feeding pattern, whatever it was. But it was pretty cool to see. So I imagine similar things, but I'm wondering, like, this might be a good episode to find someone that could talk about this, is like why they do this stuff, and if like between different types of trout, if like one's more aggressive, if one does it for a certain reason, etc. That was a lot. I just went on right there, but
no, that makes sense. And I read that in this book, and
yeah,
I honestly can't think back of any instances where I've been like, oh yeah, big fish, a little bit smaller fish, a little bit smaller fish, a little bit smaller fish behind it. I don't know if I've seen that personally, but I know it happens and it makes sense. But I'm trying to think of like Rocky Ford or any other clear, or even up here. I don't know if I've seen that specifically, but it makes sense. I know it happens. But yeah, go ahead.
I actually have a video of it on my phone, so if we make this into an episode, like the day of, I'll drop that video too.
That'll be cool.
Yeah.
I think one of the coolest feeding behaviors I've ever seen was when I was in Western Alaska, and I went out to the boats, like, and when it was dark out, like late in the night, I got out of the tent, went to the boats, and I had my headlamp on the water, and I saw this wake on the water, and these trout, their eyes reflect light, and I flashed my flashlight, and it was 2 rainbows, like 20+ inch rainbows, literally swimming side by side, even with each other along the surface. And they were going on a wake. They were just swimming up current, like perfectly in line, synchronized with each other, right along the surface, like creating a wake. And as soon as they like got close to me with my headlamp, they like just darted off. But they were like pack hunting. I've heard of trout doing this, but I've never seen it. But they're like wolves. They'll pack hunt at night. And these 2 fish were paralleling the bank on the surface, looking for food, hunting as a pack. It was incredible to see.
Holy shit, that's crazy.
Dude, I had never seen anything like that before. It was crazy.
So do you think it's like, you know how like orcas, they'll like help each other with the seals? Like the one will go like stun the seal, and then the other one will like flip the seal, and then the other ones will like eat the seal. You think trout do that with like mice and stuff up there? Like one will go like stun the mice, the other one will eat it, and then they'll like just go back and forth.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I bet you that if they were on the surface like that, I bet you they were looking for mice, because there's a lot of mice and mice-like animals out there. Well, anywhere in Alaska, but out in Western Alaska, we caught a lot of fish on mice. So obviously there's mice out there, and I'm sure those fish were paralleling that bank looking for mice to fall in, and they were going to go whack them.
Yeah.
It was incredible. I'd never seen anything like that before.
That's super cool. I'm sure there's like people that study these fish and look for those moments. That might be like a once in a lifetime kind of thing you just witnessed.
I don't know. Perfect time. I probably had to get like something to eat or had to take a leak or something, went by the water. All right, let me look at this video here. How do I go full screen? So what am I looking for in this video?
So in the video,
okay, I think I see it.
Yeah, you see, if you look, you'll see little like streaks in the rock. So like, look at the rocks; those are all trout. Yeah, so you see like towards the front, the big streak, that was a big trout. Okay. And then right behind it, there's a bunch of little streaks in the rocks. Those are all also trout that were all feeding.
So it's kind of from front to back, kind of right to left. They go from bigger to smaller.
Yeah, so you'll see like the very front, you see like that big trout, and I couldn't get them to eat. Like I threw everything at them. I'd try to like put streamers and strip them back towards me, like get behind them in that shallow water. And I would, I threw dries first, and then I would like go to nymphs, and then I switched to streamers. And these fish, when you're standing up on the log and you're watching them, they're feeding, like they're clearly eating stuff. And I tried multiple times, and we never could get these fish to eat anything we threw at them.
Was this on a guide trip?
No, this was me and Alex. Like, this was 2020. So
Alex Kuiper?
Yeah, Alex Kuiper.
Dang.
And we were just there messing around, having fun.
Was this in your urban fishery?
This was in one of the urban fisheries. And you
Nice.
can actually, if you look at the video, you can see him throwing his dry fly. Like,
Yeah, that's what I noticed. Like, there's somebody else fishing here.
yeah, that's him. So he was fishing that, and we tried like doing dry droppers and throwing everything at him. I think he might have managed to get a little one, but like I was like, oh, me and him sat up there. This big tree went down in this hole, and I'm standing up on the tree, and I mean the thing's not going to move. The tree was like super super big, really old, been stuck there since I was like a kid. So I walked out on it, and we're standing on it looking down, or I'm looking down. I'm telling Alex like, oh, throw it to the left and set it right about here, and he would throw it, and like every once in a while you got like a little reaction, but it was like the fish were like, I ain't eating that shit. They just like move to the left, and your bugs would float right by their face. And it's such a cool little it's a cool little fishery. So
For sure. I was reading in that prospecting for trout book
mm-hmm.
today, actually, talking about the different types of like insect drift and how what trout see drifting towards them is dictated sometimes by the amount of light and like when those bugs are drifting and moving around in the current, because they know that trout can't see them as easily at night, so sometimes those bugs will move around at night and then they'll slowly taper off throughout the day. And part of it was I think he was on the South Platte. Tom Roosevelt was on the South Platte talking about fishing this tailwater, and he like reaching into the weeds and he grabbed like a handful of like scuds, sow bugs, like little beta nymphs. Mm-hmm. And he was trying to sight fish to these rainbows, but he couldn't get them to eat. Like, they couldn't get them to eat the scuds, even though that's an abundant food source. Tried betas, didn't work. He looked down at his feet, and since it was the tailwater was heavily populated with fish, the wake that he was creating, there were several trout stacked up in his wake, eating whatever he kicked up. Now, in some places, I think it might be illegal to target those fish, but highly unethical. It's called shuffling, when you're purposely kicking up the stream bed to try to dislodge insects that those trout will eat. So he didn't fish for those fish specifically, but mm-hmm. he was seeing that they were eating something that he couldn't see, something so small. So he assumed, because somebody he had talked to had given him like a really small like midge pupa, like a tiny, like a 22. And as soon as he put that in and casted some other fish that he was sight fishing to ahead of him, that's when he started catching fish. And so even though you have an insect that they might see, like say a March brown in the Yakima, right? But mm-hmm. they're not seeing March browns enough. Like maybe say a March brown goes by like once every 5 minutes, and maybe mm-hmm. they have a stonefly going by once every 2 minutes, but they have like a midge pupa that goes by like every 30 seconds. They're probably going to eat that midge pupa because it's a food source that they've keyed in on at that time. Yeah. So maybe the insects, like in this case that you were throwing, maybe they see those types of insects and those nymphs, but they don't see them enough. There was one other insect that they were keying in on more, because at that time on that specific day, they were eating that insect more over whatever you were throwing.
So that's funny that you bring this up, because like as my first season guiding, we're out trying to do some dry fly fishing. We did pretty good on nymphing. So I was like, oh, let's try. It got cloudy. I was like, we're going to switch over. We're going to do some October caddis fishing. Mm-hmm. And so I'm fishing this October caddis where they're just slamming nasty, good water, just putting great drifts. And, the angler that I was with that day was experienced. So he was throwing great drifts, and I was like, oh man, these fish are not eating this October caddis. So I go around like 2 bends, and then I'm like, I'm gonna try something. And so I used a copper, it's like a purple, it's a purple Adams, like the purple haze, but it was just copper color. And I put that on trailing, I put it like 2-3 feet behind the October caddis, slaps it on the water, puts a good drift in it. Fish eats the copper Adams. And that's what you're saying is once I like got out of that, because when I first started keying in on those October caddis, I was like, there's like money bags flying around me. I was like, oh sweet, this is awesome, big October caddis, I'm so excited. But then once I switched over and I threw that copper haze, that copper, it's the copper atoms on, I started noticing there was a lot of little bugs popping off like that. And you and Keegan had mentioned that you're like, I know you'll see stuff, and just because you see it doesn't mean that's always the case. You should be fishing that. So that's like the little learning experience for me. And then I'm hoping that if someone's listening to this, that they'll be able to be like, oh, you're a new angler or experienced angler. Don't always key in on the big stuff. Like you might see a lot of caddis popping off, but there might be some like mayflies mixed in, or like you're saying, and don't get all caught up on that, because there might be, like you're saying, is like there might be more of the mayflies going by at a quicker rate than like a giant clump of caddis every once in a while.
Yeah. Maybe you think of one giant October caddis going by every 5 minutes on the Yakima, and you're trout holding behind a rock, but every 30 seconds a little copper colored mayfly comes by. You're gonna eat that copper colored mayfly over that caddis because there's more there.
Yeah. That yeah, absolutely.
Well, cool, Keaton. I don't know how long we've been talking, but I think we've been talking for a while. You and I were having a conversation, and I was like, boop, record button, because I knew that the information we were dropping would have been good for a podcast. And that's why we started the podcast, is exactly for these conversations, because these are the kind of conversations Keaton and I have regularly.
Yeah.
So why aren't we recording this? This is good information that people can use.
I don't always portray it right, but I think people will get the message, of course.
Yeah, I think it's great.
Yeah, sometimes I just like fumble a little bit on my stories, but I get the message out. So
for sure. Yeah. Well, Keaton, want to wrap this one up for us?
Oh, is this gonna be a podcast?
Yeah, it's gonna be a podcast. We've been recording this whole time. It's been almost an hour.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to us talk for about an hour, and we're just kind of talking about whatever comes to mind on these types of podcasts. So we hope that this information, you can learn something, or this might bring us up future ideas for podcasts to bring people on and talk about it. At the end of this, me and Kyle aren't experts on every subject and everything that in the outdoors, surprisingly. So we just like conversating about it though, and getting our minds moving. But I hope you enjoyed this, and I just want to thank you for listening and taking the time to listen to us blabber on. And once again, this is another small talk of the Young Guides podcast, and I'm Keaton.
I'm Kyle.
And that's it.
Catch you on the next one.
On the next one.